year was 1326. Bursa had just fallen. Osman's son, Orhan Gazi, stood at the gates of his newly conquered city, gazing at a landscape that would soon define the fate of empires. But while the soldiers celebrated their victory and the spoils of war, another kind of battle was about to begin, one far less bloody, but far more enduring: the battle of paperwork. In these early days, the Ottoman state was little more than a loose confederation of tribal warriors. Governance was oral, laws were spoken, decrees were shouted, and decisions were made in the smoky tents of tribal chieftains. But cities like Bursa could not be ruled with campfire declarations. Urban centers demanded records, contracts, ledgers, and most troublesome of all, taxes. Orhan realized quickly that while his warriors had conquered a city, they had no idea how to run it. The first scribes, unsung architects of empire as Orhan, set about stabilizing his new domain. A peculiar class of individuals became increasingly important: not soldiers, not merchants, but scribes. Men who knew how to take the Sultan's spoken word and etch it into permanence with ink and parchment. They were called katibs, and in the Ottoman world, they would become as powerful as any sword-wielding pasha. These early scribes had a daunting task. The Ottomans were expanding fast, but they had no formal system to record land ownership, tax obligations, or legal decrees. Everything had been fluid, tribal, and temporary. But empires cannot afford vagueness. The need for a divan, a formal council that could handle state affairs with documentation, was no longer optional. It was survival. The earliest divan was modest. It convened in tents, with records kept in wooden chests. But even this embryonic form of bureaucracy was revolutionary for a state born in the chaos of frontier warfare. Decrees of gold, the firman's rise to power in those days. A firman, an imperial decree, could change the destiny of entire regions. But the Ottomans quickly realized the problem. If anyone could claim to have received an oral order from the Sultan, chaos would ensue. Counterfeit commands were spreading like wildfire. Local warlords would forge the Sultan's name to legitimize land grabs, tax exemptions, or even the execution of rivals. The solution? Put it in writing. And not just any writing, lavish, ornate, and bearing the Sultan's tukra, an imperial calligraphic signature that was impossible to replicate without the skills of a master scribe. With every firman issued, the bureaucracy's roots dug deeper into the soil of the empire. For subjects, a firman was a direct line to the Sultan's will. For officials, it was a weapon to wield against rivals. For scribes, it was job security. The problem of distance, when messages outran the messengers. But there was a problem even the most beautiful firman couldn't solve: distance. As the Ottoman territories sprawled across Anatolia and into the Balkans, communication became a bureaucratic nightmare. Orders sent from the capital would often arrive too late. Sometimes after the situation they were meant to address had already resolved, usually in chaos. This bottleneck exposed a critical weakness in the empire's early administrative system. Decisions were centralized, but execution was decentralized and inconsistent. Local governors, or beys, wielded enormous autonomy, often interpreting or outright ignoring the Sultan's commands. In response, Orhan's court began experimenting with relay stations, primitive post offices where messengers could change horses and quickly dispatch imperial orders. This embryonic postal system would, in time, become a backbone of Ottoman administration. The first paper mountains, birth of the tax registers. As the need for systematic governance grew, so too did the importance of tax records. The Ottomans inherited the Byzantine practice of meticulous land surveys, and the scribes began compiling tahrir defterleri, detailed registers that listed villages, farmlands, population counts, and taxable incomes. Every field, every orchard, every watermill was cataloged with obsessive precision. These records were not just for taxation, they were proof of imperial control. A village written down in a defter was a village claimed by the empire. To be left unrecorded was to be left unprotected, vulnerable to bandits, rival lords, or worse, forgotten by history. But this process was painstakingly slow. Expeditions of scribes, escorted by armed guards, would traverse newly conquered lands for months, sometimes years, compiling these exhaustive records. The empire's bureaucracy was, in many ways, born in these dusty journeys across mountains and rivers. as ink met parchment under the flicker of oil lamps. The bureaucrats' prestige a new kind of power as the Ottoman state formalized its administrative practices. A subtle shift occurred in the social hierarchy. Warriors had always been at the top, but now men with ink-stained fingers began to rise in influence. Bureaucrats were not just clerks, they became power brokers, gatekeepers of information and interpreters of imperial will. Young men from educated families aspired not to the battlefield but to the scribal court. To become a Raisal Kutab, the chief scribe, was to stand a heartbeat away from the Sultan's ear. Even the Sultan's council meetings evolved. No longer were they informal gatherings of warlords. They became structured, ceremonial, and most importantly documented. Every decision, every debate was meticulously recorded and archived. A legacy of paper and ink by the end of Orhan's reign, the Ottoman bureaucracy had transformed from a patchwork of tribal customs into a nascent but formidable administrative machine. What started as a necessity for survival had blossomed into a defining feature of Ottoman governance. The empire was still young. The scribe's ink was still wet on the pages of history. But already, the foundations were being laid for a bureaucratic system that would outlast not only Orhan but the empire itself. The Ottomans had learned a simple yet profound truth. You could conquer with the sword, but you could only rule with the pen. By the mid-10th century, the Ottoman Empire had grown into a sprawling domain. The conquest of Constantinople in 1453 was not just a military triumph, it was a bureaucratic earthquake. For with every new territory added, every new village claimed, there came a flood of paperwork. And at the center of this bureaucratic storm was a single, swirling symbol of power, the Sultan's tukra. It was not just a signature. It was not merely a royal autograph. The tukra was an art form, a weapon, a seal of absolute authority. When the Sultan's tukra was stamped onto a firman, that document became law. Land could be gifted or seized. Cities could rise from the ground or be condemned to ruin. Lives could be elevated or erased, all with a flourish of ink. The tukra, a signature that could rule an empire, the tukra was more than an ornate swirl of calligraphy. It was a visual manifestation of the Sultan's will. Crafted with masterful precision by palace calligraphers, every curve and stroke was loaded with meaning. To the untrained eye, it was just a decorative insignia. To those in the know, it was a symbol of unchallengeable power. The tukra contained the Sultan's name, his father's name, and an invocation of his imperial authority, but it was also a security feature. Forging a tukra was not just illegal, it was nearly impossible. The unique, fluid artistry of each Sultaness tukra made it a bureaucratic fingerprint that validated any firman bearing it. For the empire's administrators, receiving a firman with the Sultan's tukra was akin to holding a key to absolute power. That one piece of paper could appoint a governor, transfer vast lands, authorize trade privileges, or even command a public execution. The firman's journey from palace to province, but the journey of a firman was far from simple. After the Sultan's decree was drafted and the tukra applied, the firman embarked on a bureaucratic pilgrimage. First, it passed through the hands of the Raisal Kutab, who ensured its language conformed to the rigid standards of imperial etiquette. A single misworded line could alter the document's meaning, so every firman was scrutinized with painstaking care. Next, the document was registered in the imperial archives. This was not merely administrative housekeeping, it was an act of control. By ensuring a copy existed in the palace records, the bureaucracy could track whether provincial governors obeyed or defied the Sultan's commands. Then, the firman was dispatched via the empire's intricate courier system. Mounted messengers, known as ulak, would carry these documents across vast distances, often riding through treacherous terrain to deliver the Sultaness' will to the furthest corners of the empire. Bureaucratic drama. When firmans collided, yet the Sultan's firman did not always have the final word. In the tangled web of Ottoman administration, conflicts often arose when multiple firmans overlapped or contradicted each other. Imagine a scenario where one firman granted a tax exemption to a village for its loyalty during a conflict, while another firman, issued later, imposed new levies on the same district to fund a military campaign. Which firman held authority, the older one as a sign of royal promise, or the newer one reflecting the empire's current needs? These bureaucratic clashes often led to disputes between local governors, religious judges, and provincial scribes. Entire council meetings could be consumed by debates over the precedence and authenticity of overlapping firmans. The Grand Vizier, bureaucracy's gatekeeper to navigate these conflicts, the role of the Grand Vizier became pivotal. Acting as the Sultan's chief executive, the Grand Vizier was the highest-ranking bureaucrat in the empire, entrusted with interpreting and implementing the Sultan's decrees. But the Grand Vizier was not merely a mouthpiece. He wielded considerable autonomy in managing the flow of firmans, often determining which decrees were emphasized, delayed, or quietly shelved. In a way, the bureaucracy itself became a political battlefield, where the Sultan's intentions were filtered through layers of administrative interpretation. Under powerful Grand Viziers like Sakalu Mehmed Pasha, the Ottoman bureaucracy reached new heights of sophistication. Sakalu was known for his meticulous management of decrees, ensuring that even the most minor provincial disputes were documented, categorized, and archived with obsessive precision. The power of a stamp, bureaucracy as a weapon for ambitious officials, the firman was not just a tool of governance, it was a ladder of personal advancement. Provincial governors, known as beys or sanjakbis, would lobby tirelessly to obtain firmans granting them authority over lucrative trade routes, tax farms, or judicial exemptions. Bribes, gifts, and political favors flowed into the capital, all aimed at securing the Sultan's penstroke. It was common for a wealthy landowner to sponsor the construction of a mosque or a public fountain, not purely out of piety, but in hopes that such charity would curry favor and earn them a beneficial firman. But this system had its dark side. Corruption seeped into the bureaucratic machinery, with some officials forging unauthorized firmans or exploiting ambiguous language to expand their power. To combat this, the Ottomans established rigorous inspection protocols, sending secret inspectors known as mefettis to audit provincial administrations and ensure compliance with imperial decrees. Bureaucracy and the commoner life under the Sultan's pen for the average Ottoman subject. The bureaucracy was a distant but omnipresent force. Taxes, land ownership, marriage rights, and even burial practices were all regulated by imperial paperwork. A peasant might spend his entire life without ever seeing the Sultan, but the shadow of the Sultan's tukra loomed over every aspect of his daily existence. From the fields he plowed to the markets he traded in, all were governed by decrees sealed in the palace hundreds of miles away. Yet the bureaucracy was not entirely heartless. Subjects could petition the Sultan through formal appeals, known as arsu'a, written by professional scribes. While only a fraction of these petitions reached the Sultan's ears, they provided a crucial outlet for grievances, embedding a primitive form of administrative justice into the imperial system, ink that shaped cities. By the late 15th century, the Ottoman bureaucracy had become a double-edged sword. On one side, it was a marvel of administrative efficiency, capable of projecting imperial will across vast distances. On the other, it was a labyrinth of procedures where power plays, bribes, and political intrigue turned paperwork into a battlefield. But one thing remained constant. A single firman, bearing the Sultan's tukra, could change everything. Cities could rise or fall, fortunes could be made or destroyed, all with a signature. The Ottomans had mastered the art of governance through paper and ink. And as their empire expanded, so too would the reach of their bureaucracy, becoming not just a system of administration, but the very skeleton of imperial power. By the dawn of the 16th century, the Ottoman Empire had become a colossal organism. It stretched from the cold plains of Hungary to the sun-scorched deserts of Arabia. Its armies had grown into one of the most disciplined military machines in the world. But behind the scenes of conquest and glory, another force quietly held the empire together, a council of scribes, judges, and viziers known simply as the divan. To the outsider, the divan was just a council. But to those within, it was the beating heart of Ottoman bureaucracy, a place where whispers became laws, where debates on paper were more decisive than battles in the field. From tents to marble halls, the evolution of the divan in its earliest days, the Ottoman court was a mobile affair. The Sultan's council would gather in war tents, its decisions scribbled onto parchment under the glow of lanterns. But as the empire solidified, so too did its administrative body. With the conquest of Constantinople, the divan found a permanent home within the stone walls of Topkapi Palace. Here, in rooms lined with Iznik tiles and guarded by elite eunuchs, the daily governance of a vast empire unfolded. The once improvised council had transformed into a structured ceremonial institution. The Kubulti, a domed chamber within Topkapi, became the divan's nerve center. Beneath its arches, viziers debated military campaigns, tax reforms, and diplomatic treaties. Every word was recorded by an army of scribes, their pens moving as swiftly as the tongues of their masters. The Grand Vizier, the empire's administrative titan at the helm of the divan, stood the Grand Vizier. He was not just a chief minister, he was the empire's administrative titan, the Sultan's proxy in matters of governance. While the Sultan reigned in splendor, it was often the Grand Vizier who ruled in practice. Clad in ceremonial robes and wielding a seal of office, the Grand Vizier presided over the divan with absolute authority. He managed the flow of firmans, oversaw the empire's finances, and acted as the final arbiter in legal disputes that reached the council. Powerful Grand Viziers like Kaprulu Mehmed Pasha turned the office into a hereditary dynasty of bureaucrats, ensuring that their family's grip on the machinery of governance endured across generations. Members of the divan, a bureaucratic orchestra, but the divan was not a one-man show. It was a carefully orchestrated ensemble of officials, each playing a distinct role in the symphony of empire. Viziers, senior ministers who advised on state affairs. The number of viziers expanded over time, reflecting the empire's growing complexity. Deftergar, the head of financial affairs, responsible for the empire's treasury, tax collection, and fiscal policies. Kaid Yaskir, the chief military judges for Rumelia and Anatolia, ensuring that justice was administered across the empire's vast territories. Nizeng, the official tasked with affixing the Sultan's tukra to imperial documents, making him a gatekeeper of official legitimacy. Raisul Kutab, the chief of scribes, responsible for overseeing correspondence, diplomatic records, and the accuracy of imperial decrees. Each of these figures brought stacks of documents, ledgers, and petitions to the divan's meetings. Discussions could last for hours, sometimes days, as bureaucrats dissected every detail of governance, from the price of grain in Cairo to the behavior of unruly governors in Baghdad. The ceremony of bureaucracy, rituals of the divan, the proceedings of the divan were a spectacle of ceremonial precision. Every morning, after the call to prayer, the council members would assemble in the Kubulti. Their entrance was a carefully choreographed display, with ranks of officials bowing in unison as the Grand Vizier took his seat. The Sultan, contrary to popular belief, did not attend divan meetings regularly. Instead, he would observe from a hidden lattice window above the council chamber, listening to debates without being seen. This allowed the Sultan to monitor his officials while maintaining an air of aloof authority. Before the council adjourned, the decisions were read aloud, ensuring that every participant, from the highest vizier to the humblest scribe, heard the final verdicts. These decisions were then meticulously copied and archived, creating a paper trail that would echo through centuries. The power of the pen, how bureaucrats outranked beys while the empire's military elites often viewed the bureaucrats with disdain. Dismissing them as men of the pen, the divan's influence was undeniable. A vizier's decision could overrule a bey's demand. A defterdar's accounting could determine the fate of entire provinces. The pen in the Ottoman world was not merely a writing instrument, it was a weapon of governance. This bureaucratic power often clashed with the ambitions of provincial governors who resented the central authority's intrusion into their domains. Yet the divan's decisions were binding. Through its decrees, the central government asserted its will over rebellious pashas and local warlords. Bureaucracy and diplomacy, the divan's global role beyond internal administration, the divan played a crucial role in shaping the empire's foreign policy. Ambassadors from Venice, Persia, and France would present themselves at the divan, their gifts scrutinized, their petitions debated. The divan's scribes, masters of diplomatic correspondence, ensured that every treaty, alliance, or declaration of war was documented with flawless precision. Diplomatic exchanges often involved elaborate rituals, where the Grand Vizier would read aloud imperial responses, carefully worded to convey both Ottoman superiority and political pragmatism. Behind these displays of protocol, however, was a labyrinth of bureaucratic maneuvering, where officials weighed every word for its potential repercussions. Archives of empire, the silent witnesses every decision made in the divan generated a cascade of paperwork. These documents were not discarded after use. Instead, they were stored in the imperial archives, a sprawling collection of records that chronicled the empire's administrative heartbeat. The archives were more than just storage rooms. They were historical fortresses, safeguarding the legal and administrative memory of the empire. A dispute over land ownership, even decades later, could be resolved by retrieving a document sealed and stored within these walls. For Ottoman scribes, the act of writing was not ephemeral. It was eternal. Their ink was meant to last beyond lifetimes, embedding their decisions into the very structure of the empire's governance. The divan's quiet dominance as centuries passed, the divan's influence only grew. Even as sultans indulged in the pleasures of the harem or embarked on military campaigns, the daily governance of the empire continued uninterrupted, managed by the tireless machinery of the divan. It was a system designed not for speed, but for stability. Decisions were deliberate. Processes were slow, methodical, and often infuriatingly complex. But in that complexity lay the secret to the empire's endurance. By embedding every action in layers of documentation, debate, and ritual, the Ottomans ensured that no decision was made lightly and no mistake went unnoticed. The divan was the empire's mind, its voice, and its memory. It turned conquests into provinces, subjects into citizens, and commands into enduring laws. By the dawn of the 16th century, the Ottoman Empire had become a colossal organism. It stretched from the cold plains of Hungary to the sun-scorched deserts of Arabia. Its armies had grown into one of the most disciplined military machines in the world. But behind the scenes of conquest and glory, another force quietly held the empire together. A council of scribes, judges, and viziers known simply as the divan. To the outsider, the divan was just a council. But to those within, it was the beating heart of Ottoman bureaucracy, a place where whispers became laws, where debates on paper were more decisive than battles in the field. From tents to marble halls, the evolution of the divan in its earliest days, the Ottoman court was a mobile affair. The Sultan's council would gather in war tents, its decisions scribbled onto parchment under the glow of lanterns. But as the empire solidified, so too did its administrative body. With the conquest of Constantinople, the divan found a permanent home within the stone walls of Topkapi Palace. Here, in rooms lined with Iznik tiles and guarded by elite eunuchs, the daily governance of a vast empire unfolded. The once improvised council had transformed into a structured ceremonial institution. The Kubulti, a domed chamber within Topkapi, became the divan's nerve center. Beneath its arches, viziers debated military campaigns, tax reforms, and diplomatic treaties. Every word was recorded by an army of scribes, their pens moving as swiftly as the tongues of their masters. The Grand Vizier, the empire's administrative titan at the helm of the divan, stood the Grand Vizier. He was not just a chief minister, he was the empire's administrative titan, the Sultan's proxy in matters of governance. While the Sultan reigned in splendor, it was often the Grand Vizier who ruled in practice. Clad in ceremonial robes and wielding a seal of office, the Grand Vizier presided over the divan with absolute authority. He managed the flow of firmans, oversaw the empire's finances, and acted as the final arbiter in legal disputes that reached the council. Powerful Grand Viziers like Kapulu Mehmed Pasha turned the office into a hereditary dynasty of bureaucrats, ensuring that their families' grip on the machinery of governance endured across generations. Members of the divan, a bureaucratic orchestra, but the divan was not a one-man show. It was a carefully orchestrated ensemble of officials, each playing a distinct role in the symphony of empire: viziers, senior ministers who advised on state affairs. The number of viziers expanded over time, reflecting the empire's growing complexity. Defterder, the head of financial affairs, responsible for the empire's treasury, tax collection, and fiscal policies. Kadyaskar, the chief military judges for Rumelia and Anatolia, ensuring that justice was administered across the empire's vast territories. Nizank, the official tasked with affixing the Sultan's tukra to imperial documents, making him a gatekeeper of official legitimacy. Raisul Kutab, the chief of scribes, responsible for overseeing correspondence, diplomatic records, and the accuracy of imperial decrees. Each of these figures brought stacks of documents, ledgers, and petitions to the divan's meetings. Discussions could last for hours, sometimes days, as bureaucrats dissected every detail of governance, from the price of grain in Cairo to the behavior of unruly governors in Baghdad. The ceremony of bureaucracy, rituals of the divan, the proceedings of the divan were a spectacle of ceremonial precision. Every morning, after the call to prayer, the council members would assemble in the Kubbalti. Their entrance was a carefully choreographed display, with ranks of officials bowing in unison as the Grand Vizier took his seat. The Sultan, contrary to popular belief, did not attend divan meetings regularly. Instead, he would observe from a hidden lattice window above the council chamber, listening to debates without being seen. This allowed the Sultan to monitor his officials while maintaining an air of aloof authority. Before the council adjourned, the decisions were read aloud, ensuring that every participant, from the highest vizier to the humblest scribe, heard the final verdicts. These decisions were then meticulously copied and archived, creating a paper trail that would echo through centuries. The power of the pen, how bureaucrats outright base. While the empire's military elites often viewed the bureaucrats with disdain, dismissing them as men of the pen, the divan's influence was undeniable. A vizier's decision could overrule a bey's demand. A defterder's accounting could determine the fate of entire provinces. The pen, in the Ottoman world, was not merely a writing instrument, it was a weapon of governance. This bureaucratic power often clashed with the ambitions of provincial governors, who resented the central authority's intrusion into their domains, yet the divan's decisions were binding. Through its decrees, the central government asserted its will over rebellious pashas and local warlords. Bureaucracy and diplomacy, the divan's global role beyond internal administration, the divan played a crucial role in shaping the empire's foreign policy. Ambassadors from Venice, Persia, and France would present themselves at the divan, their gifts scrutinized, their petitions debated. The divan's scribes, masters of diplomatic correspondence, ensured that every treaty, alliance, or declaration of war was documented with flawless precision. Diplomatic exchanges often involved elaborate rituals, where the Grand Vizier would read aloud imperial responses, carefully worded to convey both Ottoman superiority and political pragmatism. Behind these displays of protocol, however, was a labyrinth of bureaucratic maneuvering, where officials weighed every word for its potential repercussions. Archives of empire, the silent witnesses every decision made in the divan, generated a cascade of paperwork. These documents were not discarded after use. Instead, they were stored in the imperial archives, a sprawling collection of records that chronicled the empire's administrative heartbeat. The archives were more than just storage rooms. They were historical fortresses, safeguarding the legal and administrative memory of the empire. A dispute over land ownership, even decades later, could be resolved by retrieving a document sealed and stored within these walls. For Ottoman scribes, the act of writing was not ephemeral. It was eternal. Their ink was meant to last beyond lifetimes, embedding their decisions into the very structure of the empire's governance. The divan's quiet dominance as centuries passed, the divan's influence only grew. Even as sultans indulged in the pleasures of the harem or embarked on military campaigns, the daily governance of the empire continued uninterrupted. Managed by the tireless machinery of the divan, it was a system designed not for speed, but for stability. Decisions were deliberate. Processes were slow, methodical, and often infuriatingly complex. But in that complexity lay the secret to the empire's endurance. By embedding every action in layers of documentation, debate, and ritual, the Ottomans ensured that no decision was made lightly and no mistake went unnoticed. The divan was the empire's mind, its voice, and its memory. It turned conquests into provinces, subjects into citizens, and commands into enduring laws. In the early days of the Ottoman Empire, the machinery of governance was as mobile as its armies. Decisions were made under canvas tents, ledgers were kept in wooden chests, and scribes followed the Sultan wherever his conquests led. But empires crave stability. As the Ottoman dominion expanded, the need for a permanent center of administration became undeniable. By the mid-15th century, the Ottomans had outgrown the era of tented councils and roving scribes. The empire was no longer a collection of frontier warriors, but a vast, multi-ethnic superpower. It needed an administrative heart, a place where the bureaucracy could plant its roots. That place was Topkapi Palace, and within its walls, the empire's bureaucracy would evolve from a flexible, mobile system into a permanent, rigid institution that would last for centuries. Topkapi, the bureaucrat's fortress. When Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, began constructing Topkapi Palace, he envisioned more than a royal residence. He wanted a living symbol of Ottoman permanence. The sprawling complex was designed to be a city within a city, a labyrinth of courtyards, chambers, and pavilions where governance could operate without interruption. For the bureaucrats, Topkapi was not a palace of leisure. It was a fortress of paperwork. The Divan chamber, known as the Kubbalti, became the daily arena where viziers, judges, and scribes conducted the affairs of state. Massive wooden desks replaced makeshift field tables, and archives began to overflow with scrolls, firmans, and ledgers. What once had to be packed onto mules and carried from battlefield to battlefield was now enshrined in stone. Bureaucracy had found a home. The harem's hidden bureaucracy, Topkapi's bureaucratic machinery, was not limited to official council chambers. Behind the ornate screens of the imperial harem, another, more discreet form of bureaucracy thrived. While historians often depict the harem as a realm of leisure and intrigue, it was, in fact, a vital administrative unit. The women of the harem, particularly the Valid Sultan, and the Sultaness' favored consorts wielded considerable influence over imperial policies. They operated through a network of trusted eunuchs and scribes, drafting petitions, influencing appointments, and even altering the course of state decisions from behind velvet curtains. The bureaucracy within the harem was subtle, informal, and often invisible to official records. Yet its impact resonated through the corridors of power, proving that paperwork and influence did not always wear ceremonial robes. The imperial chancery, where documents were forged in gold. At the heart of Topkapi's bureaucratic complex stood the imperial chancery, where documents were drafted, copied, and sealed. The scribes here were not mere clerks. They were artisans of language, trained to craft firmans that balanced legal precision with the elegance of Ottoman calligraphy. Each firman was a work of art, written on fine parchment, illuminated with gold leaf, and sealed with the Sultan's tukra. These documents symbolized the majesty and authority of the empire. Errors were unacceptable. A single misplaced word or poorly drawn seal could delegitimize a decree, leading to administrative chaos or political scandal. To prevent such disasters, the chancery operated with near military discipline. Every document passed through multiple layers of review, from junior scribes to senior editors, before it was presented to the Grand Vizier for final approval. The rise of the archived memory of the empire as Topkapi's bureaucracy matured, so too did its obsession with record-keeping. The Ottomans understood that power was not just about issuing commands, it was about remembering them. Thus, the empire's archives grew into a monumental repository of administrative memory. Every land grant, tax exemption, military order, and diplomatic treaty was meticulously catalogued and stored. Wooden shelves, iron-bound chests, and specially constructed document vaults became the empire's most precious assets. These archives were more than a historical curiosity. They were living tools of governance. A land dispute in Anatolia or a tax exemption in the Balkans could be resolved by unrolling a document sealed decades prior. The bureaucracy's memory became a shield against fraud, corruption, and forgetfulness. Bureaucrats as a social class, the new elite. With a permanent bureaucratic center in Topkapi, a new social class began to emerge, the Ottoman administrative elite. No longer transient scribes moving from battlefield to battlefield, these bureaucrats now formed a stable, educated class that held immense influence over imperial affairs. The path to becoming a high-ranking bureaucrat was no longer paved by family lineage alone. It required years of study, mastery of Ottoman Turkish, Persian, and Arabic, and a deep understanding of the empire's legal and administrative codes. The most prestigious bureaucrats were products of elite schools like the Enderun, where promising youths were trained in governance, languages, and the subtle art of palace etiquette. To ascend to positions like Raisu el-Kutab or Nazenk was to enter the inner circle of imperial power, where a bureaucrat's pen could command armies and alter laws. Rituals of administration, the bureaucratic day with, the bureaucracy's permanent residence in Topkapi came a rigid structure to its daily operations. Every day at dawn, the Grand Vizier and his council convened in the Kubbalti to address petitions, discuss governance, and oversee the empire's administrative pulse. Subjects from across the empire could submit written petitions known as arzuls, which were carefully reviewed by palace scribes. Those deemed significant were brought before the council, where decisions were recorded, documented, and archived. The bureaucratic rituals extended beyond meetings. The act of sealing a firman, the presentation of a tax ledger, even the reading of reports to the Sultan, all were performed with ceremonial precision. Bureaucracy had become not just a function, but a ritualized expression of Ottoman authority. Bureaucracy becomes culture. Over time, the culture of bureaucracy seeped into every facet of Ottoman life. Provinces mirrored the capital's administrative structure, establishing local divans, archives, and chancelleries. Provincial governors, or beylerbis, were expected to replicate Topkapi's bureaucratic standards in their territories, ensuring a uniform governance style across the empire. Bureaucracy became a source of identity. To be part of the Ottoman administrative apparatus was to belong to an elite club of literate, cultured officials whose influence reached from the palace gates to the furthest deserts of Arabia. The empire of paper and stone, by establishing a permanent bureaucratic core within Topkapi Palace, the Ottomans had achieved something profound. They had transformed a mobile, fragile system into a stone-clad engine of governance that could outlast the whims of any single sultan. The days of tented councils were over. Bureaucracy had found a home in marble halls and vaulted archives. It had become as immovable as the empire itself. But permanence is a double-edged sword. As the bureaucracy solidified, so too did its rituals, routines, and inevitably its red tape. The very system that gave the empire its stability would, in time, become a weight upon its agility. The Janissaries. To the world, they were the iron fist of the Ottoman Empire, an elite corps of soldiers feared for their discipline and ferocity. But behind the glint of their swords and the thunder of their muskets, there was another story. One far less glamorous, yet no less vital. The Janissaries were not just a military force. They were entangled in the empire's ever-expanding web of bureaucracy, and as their power grew, so did their paperwork. A military born from bureaucracy, the origins of the Janissaries were, from the beginning, a bureaucratic marvel. Unlike the feudal armies of Europe, the Janissaries were not knights summoned by vassals or noble families. They were a standing army, salaried, uniformed, and centrally controlled by the Sultan himself. Their recruitment was systematized through the Devshirme, a levy where Christian boys from the Balkans were selected, converted to Islam, and trained in the arts of war and administration. The Devshirme was a logistical feat requiring meticulous records of villages, population censuses, and quotas. Every boy taken, every family compensated, was documented and filed. From the moment a boy was conscripted, his life was absorbed into the empire's records. His name, origin, training progress, and eventual rank within the Janissary corps were tracked with bureaucratic precision. Salaries, rations, and rosters maintaining a standing army came with staggering administrative demands. Every Janissary received a lukat, a detailed record of his salary, allowances, and benefits. These were not mere financial ledgers. They were documents of identity. Without an alukat, a janissary did not officially exist. The Asain Defteri, or salary registers, listed every active janissary and his entitlements. These records were fiercely protected. To be inscribed in the A-Same meant not only a paycheck, but also social prestige and security. But with bureaucracy comes loopholes. Over time, powerful janissaries manipulated these records, selling alucats to outsiders or registering fictitious soldiers to siphon off salaries. This fraud, known as capu calami, became a chronic issue, forcing the central administration to conduct periodic audits, sending inspectors to cross-check rosters and weed out ghost soldiers. Bureaucrats in uniform, as the janissaries matured as an institution, they developed their own internal bureaucracy. They maintained detailed records of promotions, punishments, and even personal disputes within their ranks. The corps had scribes, secretaries, and clerks who reported to the Iga of the janissaries, their commanding officer. Orders from the Sultan or the Divan were transmitted down the chain of command through formal written decrees. The janissaries, though soldiers, were trained to respect the paper as much as the sword. Every movement, from garrison rotations to battle deployments, was accompanied by a flurry of documentation. Their barracks, especially the famed Eski Adalar in Istanbul, housed not only soldiers but archives. Within these rooms, records of centuries of service were kept, forming a parallel military bureaucracy that mirrored the empire's civil administration. The janissary guilds, when soldiers became paper pushers in the later centuries, the janissaries expanded beyond their military role. Many became involved in trade guilds, managing coffeehouses, bakeries, and artisan workshops. Their influence over Istanbul's economic life was enormous, and with it came an avalanche of bureaucratic responsibilities. Guild registers, tax records, and licensing agreements became part of the janissary scribe's daily work. The line between soldier and bureaucrat blurred. A janissary might spend his morning drilling in the barracks and his afternoon balancing the accounts of a guild cooperative. This dual identity gave the janissaries enormous leverage. They could organize protests, petitions, and even revolts with bureaucratic efficiency, submitting formal grievances to the Divan and demanding policy changes. Their uprisings were often not spontaneous riots, but carefully documented movements, armed with lists of demands and legal references. Bureaucracy as a political weapon. By the 17th century, the janissaries had mastered the art of using bureaucracy as a political weapon. They formed alliances with palace scribes, bribed officials in the chancery, and ensured their interests were safeguarded in the imperial records. When displeased with a grand vizier or a policy, they could orchestrate administrative gridlocks, refusing to implement orders or flooding the Divan with petitions. Their sheer presence in the bureaucratic apparatus allowed them to influence not just military affairs, but the very governance of the empire. The downside of paper power, however, this entanglement with bureaucracy also led to the janissaries' decline. Their focus shifted from military excellence to administrative wrangling. Promotions were secured through paperwork, not merit. Corruption in the same registers led to bloated ranks filled with unqualified men. The once elite corps became a sluggish institution, more adept at filing complaints than fighting wars. The bureaucracy that had once empowered them now ossified them. An empire of ink. The janissaries' story is a testament to the Ottoman Empire's unique relationship with bureaucracy. They were soldiers, yet their power was not just in their muskets, but in their mastery of paper. They understood that in an empire ruled by decrees, registers, and firmans, the pen was as sharp a weapon as any blade. As the 19th century dawned and the empire faced new pressures to reform, the bloated janissary corps would find itself on a collision course with the very bureaucracy it had once dominated. But that is a story for another chapter. As the Ottoman Empire expanded across 3 continents, the challenge of governing distant provinces became a test of bureaucratic endurance. Conquering cities and territories was one thing. Integrating them into the administrative fabric of the empire was another. This is where the empire's intricate bureaucracy became not just a tool of governance, but a weapon of control. The Beylerbeylik system, provincial governance on paper. The empire was divided into large provinces known as Beylerbeyliks, each overseen by a Beylerbeyi or Bey of Beys. These provincial governors were powerful men, often seasoned military commanders, but their authority was not absolute. Every decision they made had to align with the protocols dictated by Istanbul. Orders from the central government arrived in the form of firmans, imperial decrees meticulously copied by scribes and sealed with the Sultan's tukra. These firmans specified not only what had to be done, but how it had to be done down to the last detail. Every Beylerbeyi was required to maintain a constant flow of reports back to the capital, records of tax collection, law enforcement, population surveys, and military readiness. These reports were reviewed by officials in the Divan, who cross-checked them against other sources to ensure compliance and accuracy. Cadis and the judicial bureaucracy alongside the administrative hierarchy, the Ottomans deployed a network of Cadis' judges who operated courts in every significant town and city. These Cadis were not only arbiters of Sharia law, but also bureaucrats tasked with maintaining judicial records. Court proceedings, land disputes, marriage contracts, and criminal cases were all meticulously recorded in sicils, court registers that served as legal reference books for years to come. These sicils were sent periodically to the central archives in Istanbul, creating a paper trail that connected a remote village court to the empire's core. Cadis acted as watchdogs over provincial governors, empowered to report abuses of power directly to the Sultan. Their detailed records served as both legal documentation and political surveillance, ensuring that the Sultan's will was enacted even in the furthest corners of his realm. The role of the Tahrir Defters, mapping the empire no tool of Ottoman provincial control, was as comprehensive as the Tahrir Defters, tax and land registers that documented every village, plot of land, and taxable resource within the empire. Compiling a Tahrir Defter was a monumental bureaucratic undertaking. Teams of scribes, surveyors, and military escorts would traverse the provinces, recording data with astonishing detail: the names of landholders, the size of their plots, the crops they cultivated, and the taxes they owed. These registers were not static. They were updated regularly to reflect demographic changes, economic shifts, and administrative reforms. A landowner's rights, a peasant's obligations, even a village's very existence were legitimized through their presence in the Tahrir Defters. Governors in chains, the power of imperial audits. The central administration maintained its grip on provincial governors through a rigorous system of audits and inspections. Officials known as meticulous were dispatched to investigate complaints, verify tax records, and assess the conduct of local authorities. An unfavorable report from a meticulous could spell disaster for a governor. Dismissal, fines, or even execution could follow if corruption, negligence, or rebellion was discovered. These audits were not merely punitive. They were preventive. The constant threat of inspection ensured that provincial officials remained tethered to the central bureaucracy, their power constrained by the ever-present eye of the empire's paper trail. Bureaucracy versus local autonomy yet. The relationship between the central bureaucracy and provincial autonomy was a delicate balancing act. In some regions, particularly in the Arab provinces and the fringes of the Balkans, local customs and governance structures were tolerated, even incorporated into the Ottoman system. The bureaucracy adapted by creating hybrid administrative models, allowing local leaders to maintain their titles and influence while binding them with bureaucratic obligations. They were required to submit reports, collect taxes in the empire's name, and enforce imperial decrees. Through this flexible yet firm approach, the Ottoman bureaucracy managed to govern a vast and diverse empire without overextending its resources. The archive empire, information as power. All provincial records, from judicial sicils to tax registers and audit reports, were funneled back to Istanbul, feeding the ever-growing imperial archives. These archives became an administrative weapon in their own right. Whenever disputes arose, whether over land ownership, inheritance, or tax exemptions, the answer often lay buried within the archives. A document, perhaps decades old, could validate a claim, expose corruption, or overturn a governor's decision. For the Ottoman state, information was power. By centralizing all knowledge within its archives, the empire ensured that no provincial authority could operate independently of Istanbul's oversight. Bureaucracy, the true conqueror. Through its bureaucracy, the Ottoman Empire transformed conquest into governance. Territories were not truly Ottoman until they were mapped, registered, and documented. The ink of scribes completed what the swords of soldiers had begun. While the empire's borders ebbed and flowed with the tides of war, its bureaucratic infrastructure remained a constant, stitching together a mosaic of peoples, languages, and traditions into a singular administrative machine. It was a paper empire as much as a territorial one, where power was measured not just in armies and fortresses, but in ledgers, registers, and archives. For the Ottoman Empire, governance was not a matter of brute force alone. The empire's stability depended on a constant supply of skilled bureaucrats who could draft decrees, maintain records, and navigate the labyrinthine protocols of administration. But where did these scribes come from? The answer lies in the scribal schools, institutions where the next generation of bureaucratic elite was forged in ink and discipline. The rise of the Kalami. By the 16th century, the Ottomans formalized their scribal bureaucracy into a distinct branch known as the Kalami, the penman. Unlike the military or religious scholars, the Kalami were career bureaucrats trained to manage the empire's vast paperwork. Entry into the Kalami was a coveted path for ambitious young men, offering a route to power that bypassed the battlefield. The training grounds for these bureaucrats were the scribal schools, often attached to palace complexes or elite administrative offices. Enderun, the palace school. The most prestigious of these institutions was the Enderun School, located within the Topkapi Palace. Originally designed to educate future statesmen, military commanders, and administrators, the Enderun became a crucible for bureaucratic talent. Students were meticulously selected through the Devshirm system or from promising Muslim families. Once admitted, they underwent rigorous training in languages: calligraphy, arithmetic, law, and statcraft. Enderun graduates were expected to master not only the art of beautiful script, but also the nuances of imperial etiquette and administrative procedure. The best students were groomed for high office, ascending to positions like Reis-i-Elk, Kutab, or even Grand Vizier. The art of calligraphy, a bureaucrat's sword in the Ottoman bureaucracy, penmanship was not a decorative skill, it was a statement of authority. Documents bore the Sultan's tukra, an intricate calligraphic monogram that symbolized imperial will. Only scribes with exceptional calligraphic skills were entrusted with drafting documents bearing the tukra. Calligraphy was seen as a reflection of the scribe's discipline and loyalty. Sloppy handwriting was not merely an aesthetic failure. It was a breach of bureaucratic order. Thus, scribal schools placed immense emphasis on perfecting the Divani script, a cursive, ornate style used in official documents. Students practiced for years, their hands guided by masters who traced lines of tradition passed down through generations. Curriculum of governance beyond calligraphy, the curriculum of scribal schools encompassed the entire machinery of governance. Students learned how to draft firmans, maintain tahrir defters, and organize financial ledgers. Lessons in Ottoman law, both Sharia and Qanon, were crucial. A scribe needed to understand legal precedents to ensure documents were not just beautifully written, but also legally sound. Training also involved simulations of court procedures, mock audits, and exercises in diplomatic correspondence. These practices ensured that graduates could seamlessly transition into the empire's administrative posts. Apprenticeships and career progression upon completing their formal education, scribes entered into apprenticeships within the imperial chancelleries. Under the guidance of seasoned officials, they honed their practical skills, learning the subtleties of document flow, archival organization, and bureaucratic diplomacy. Career progression within the Kalami was structured and merit-based. Positions like Chatib Munshi and Nishanshi marked the ascent of a scribe's career. Each rank brought greater responsibility, from managing routine paperwork to drafting policy-changing decrees. Bureaucratic patronage and networking, while talent and discipline were essential, advancement within the scribal hierarchy also depended on patronage. Ambitious scribes cultivated relationships with influential viziers, judges, and military leaders who could champion their careers. The scribal schools emphasized not only academic excellence, but also the art of bureaucratic networking. Students were taught the delicate etiquette of courtly interaction, understanding that a well-placed word in the divan could accelerate their ascent. Scribes as cultural custodians, the influence of the scribal class extended beyond administration. Many Ottoman scribes were also poets, historians, and chroniclers. Their dual role as bureaucrats and cultural custodians allowed them to shape the empire's narrative. Through their writings, they documented conquests, recorded treaties, and preserved the empire's collective memory. The bureaucratic elite thus became the authors of Ottoman history, their ink immortalizing the deeds of sultans and viziers alike. The scribal legacy, the scribal schools of the Ottoman Empire were more than educational institutions. They were factories of governance. They transformed talented youths into the guardians of imperial order, equipping them with the skills to manage an empire where a misplaced word could topple a governor, and a well-drafted firman could alter the fate of provinces. Through rigorous training in language, law, and calligraphy, the scribes of the Ottoman Empire ensured that bureaucracy was not merely functional but an enduring symbol of the Sultan's power. For centuries, the Ottoman bureaucracy had been the backbone of imperial stability, weaving together distant provinces and diverse peoples through a network of scribes, registers, and decrees. But by the 17th century, this intricate system began to show signs of strain. What had once been a finely tuned machine started to choke on its own complexity. Red tape, once a symbol of administrative precision, became a suffocating web. The overgrowth of paperwork as the empire expanded, so did its bureaucracy. New provinces meant new records, new taxes, and new layers of oversight. Every decision required documentation, every petition demanded a response, and every transaction necessitated multiple copies filed across different offices. By the 1600s, the sheer volume of paperwork had become overwhelming. The imperial chancery, once a symbol of efficiency, found itself drowning in petitions, tax disputes, and legal appeals. Scribes were overworked, archives were bursting, and decisions were delayed by months, sometimes years. The very system designed to streamline governance had begun to mire it in endless documentation. Layers upon layers of approval, one of the chief culprits of this bureaucratic bloat was the empire's obsession with hierarchical approval. A simple land dispute in a provincial village could require endorsements from local cadis, provincial bailarbis, and multiple offices within the central divan. Each layer added its own set of reviews, annotations, and counter-reviews. A firman that once could be drafted and sealed within a day now took weeks to navigate the labyrinth of bureaucratic scrutiny. This procedural excess, known colloquially as tezkar kalabalek a, turned administrative efficiency into an exhausting relay of paper shuffling. Corruption thrives in complexity. As bureaucracy grew more convoluted, it became fertile ground for corruption. Bribes, known as becames, became an unofficial currency to expedite processes. Officials who controlled bottleneck points in the bureaucratic chain could demand payments for simply moving a document to the next desk. Patronage networks flourished within this chaos. Positions within the Calamai were often sold or traded, and critical posts in tax offices became lucrative assets for those seeking personal enrichment. The line between official duties and personal gain blurred. A scribe's pen, once an instrument of imperial will, now often served the interests of the highest bidder. The paralysis of reform efforts to streamline the bureaucracy met with fierce resistance. Every attempt at reform threatened entrenched interests within the administrative hierarchy. Senior officials who had built their careers navigating and exploiting the system were unlikely to support changes that might undercut their influence. Even sultans found themselves hamstrung. Edicts calling for bureaucratic simplification were lost in the very maze they sought to untangle. Reform commissions were established, only to become yet another layer of paperwork. The system had become self-perpetuating, a labyrinth designed to maintain itself, regardless of efficiency or logic. The human cost of red tape for the empire's subjects, the bureaucratic quagmire, was not an abstract problem. It affected daily life. Tax assessments were delayed, court cases dragged on for years, and essential services were bottlenecked by administrative backlog. A peasant seeking to appeal an unjust tax would face months of petitioning, during which his livelihood could be destroyed. Merchants trying to secure trade licenses or settle commercial disputes found their ventures stalled by endless paperwork. The bureaucracy, intended to serve the empire's people, had become an obstacle they had to navigate or circumvent. Archives turned into paper tombs. The once proud imperial archives, designed as repositories of governance and memory, became paper tombs. Documents piled up faster than they could be cataloged, and critical records were often lost amidst the clutter. Archivists, overwhelmed and under-resourced, resorted to storing files in hastily constructed annexes, many of which lacked basic preservation conditions. Mold, pests, and the sheer weight of accumulated paper led to irreversible losses of valuable records. The empire's administrative memory, once its greatest asset, began to decay. The symptom of a larger decline? The bureaucratic labyrinth was not merely a problem of inefficient governance. It was a symptom of the Ottoman Empire's larger structural decline. As military defeats mounted and economic pressures intensified, the bureaucracy's inability to adapt and respond compounded the empire's vulnerabilities. What had once been an engine of control now became a drag on the state's capacity to govern. Decision-making slowed to a crawl, resources were misallocated, and public trust in imperial administration eroded. A glimmer of change on the horizon despite the stagnation, murmurs of reform persisted. Enlightened officials, aware of the system's unsustainability, began advocating for modernization. Influences from European administrative practices, combined with internal pressures, planted the seeds for future reforms. But true transformation would not come until the 19th century, when the empire faced a stark choice: reform or collapse. By the early 19th century, the Ottoman Empire stood at a crossroads. Military defeats, economic stagnation, and internal revolts had exposed the cracks in the once mighty imperial system. Reform was no longer a choice, it was a necessity for survival. This realization gave birth to the Tanzimat era, a period of sweeping reforms aimed at modernizing the empire's institutions, and at its heart was a radical reimagining of the Ottoman bureaucracy. The Gulhane Edict, a bureaucratic manifesto of the Tanzimat era, was formally inaugurated with the Gulhane Hatwai Zarif in 1839. This decree, read aloud in the gardens of the Topkapi Palace, promised sweeping changes, equal rights for all subjects, protection of life and property, and crucially a commitment to administrative reform. Unlike past edicts, which often remain mere words on paper, the Gulhane Edict marked a genuine attempt to overhaul the bureaucratic machinery. It was a public acknowledgement that the empire's future depended on streamlining governance and curbing the excesses of its labyrinthine administration. The birth of modern ministries, one of the most significant outcomes of the Tanzimat, was the creation of modern ministries. The traditional divan, with its overlapping and often chaotic departments, was restructured into specialized ministries, each with defined roles and responsibilities. New ministries for finance, justice, foreign affairs, education, and public works emerged, modeled after European governmental structures. These institutions were staffed with professional bureaucrats, selected for their expertise rather than their lineage or patronage connections. This specialization aimed to eliminate redundancy, enhance accountability, and foster efficiency. The Translation Office and the language of reform, recognizing the need to engage with European powers and their administrative practices, the Ottomans established the Translation Office. Initially tasked with diplomatic translations, this office quickly became a hub of reformist thought. Young bureaucrats trained in European languages and exposed to Western legal and administrative systems returned with fresh ideas. The Translation Office became a breeding ground for future reformers who would spearhead efforts to modernize the empire's bureaucracy. Legal codification, from custom to code a key pillar of the Tanzimat, was the codification of laws. Previously, Ottoman administration relied heavily on a blend of Sharia law and Qanon. The reforms sought to create comprehensive legal codes that were clear, consistent, and uniformly applied across the empire. The Mesal, a civil code blending Islamic jurisprudence with European legal principles, became a cornerstone of this effort. New commercial and penal codes were also introduced, modeled after the French legal system. These codifications demanded a new breed of bureaucrats, legally trained, procedurally precise, and committed to the principles of justice and equality. The rise of the professional bureaucrat, the Tanzimat reforms, professionalized the bureaucracy in ways previously unimaginable. Recruitment was increasingly merit-based, with competitive examinations introduced for certain administrative positions. New educational institutions like the Mekteb-i-Molkai were established to train civil servants in modern administrative sciences, law, and foreign languages. A career in the bureaucracy became a respectable aspiration for the empire's youth, offering a path to influence based on talent rather than birthright. Centralization versus local autonomy. While the Tanzimat aimed to streamline and centralize administration, it also had to grapple with the empire's vast and diverse territories. To balance these tensions, reforms allowed for greater involvement of local councils in administrative affairs, while ensuring these bodies remained under the purview of the central government. This hybrid model sought to integrate local elites into the reform process while tightening the central administration's grip on governance. The limits of reform, despite its ambitious scope, the Tanzimat faced formidable obstacles. Entrenched interests within the old bureaucratic guard resisted changes that threatened their privileges. Regional power brokers, wary of losing autonomy, sabotaged implementation efforts. Moreover, the reforms often outpaced the empire's capacity to implement them effectively. Infrastructure, literacy rates, and communication networks lagged, hampering the smooth execution of new policies. A new bureaucratic identity yet. The Tanzimat succeeded in planting the seeds of a new bureaucratic identity. The Ottoman scribe, once defined by ornate calligraphy and labyrinthine procedures, evolved into a modern civil servant concerned with efficiency, legality, and public service. This transformation was not merely administrative, it was cultural. The Tanzimat bureaucrat saw himself as part of a modernizing mission, tasked with saving the empire from decay and irrelevance. Legacy of the Tanzimat bureaucracy. Though the empire continued to struggle with challenges of corruption and inefficiency, the Tanzimat reforms left an enduring legacy. They created institutional frameworks that would outlive the empire itself, influencing the administrative systems of successor states like the Republic of Turkey. More importantly, the Tanzimat instilled in the Ottoman consciousness the idea that bureaucracy could be a vehicle for progress, not merely a tool of control. The Tanzimat reforms of the 19th century not only reshaped the Ottoman Empire's bureaucratic machinery, but also redefined the very identity of its civil servants. What had once been a class of obedient scribes evolved into a politically conscious, ambitious cadre of bureaucrat politicians who began to exert influence far beyond the chancery walls. The emergence of bureaucratic elites. As the professionalization of the bureaucracy advanced, a new elite emerged. Educated, reform-minded officials who saw themselves as stewards of modernization. Graduates of the Mekteb-i-Molkai and the Translation Office were not content with clerical roles. They aspired to shape policy, advise ministers, and even steer the empire's political direction. These bureaucrats, often more knowledgeable about law, economics, and international affairs than their aristocratic superiors, became indispensable to the functioning of the state. From scribes to statesmen, prominent figures like Ali Pasha, Fuad Pasha, and Midhat Pasha epitomized this transformation. Rising through the bureaucratic ranks, they leveraged their administrative expertise to ascend to the highest political offices, including that of Grand Vizier. These men were not mere implementers of sultanic will. They were policymakers, reformers, and in some cases, architects of constitutionalism. Their careers blurred the line between civil servant and statesman, marking a new era where bureaucrats could wield substantial political clout. The power of the pen in policymaking armed with deep institutional knowledge and mastery of legal codes, these bureaucrats became key players in drafting legislation, negotiating treaties, and managing complex state affairs. Unlike traditional power brokers who relied on military might or noble lineage, bureaucrat politicians derived their influence from expertise. Their command over paperwork, statistics, and legal frameworks gave them leverage in the imperial court and the divan, patronage networks, and bureaucratic factions. With power came politics. Bureaucratic elites began forming patronage networks, supporting protégés and aligning with like-minded officials to influence appointments and policy decisions. Factions emerged within the bureaucracy, some favoring aggressive modernization and westernization, others advocating a cautious balance with Islamic traditions. These internal rivalries often spilled into broader political debates, shaping the empire's direction. Bureaucrats as reformers and rebels, not all bureaucrats were content to operate within the confines of officialdom. Figures like Midhat Pasha pushed the boundaries of bureaucratic influence, championing the first Ottoman constitution of 1876. Midhat Pasha's efforts to establish a constitutional monarchy were driven by a belief that a modern bureaucracy could only thrive under a system of checks and balances. His activism marked a turning point where bureaucrats became not just enforcers of policy, but advocates for systemic change. The Young Ottomans and bureaucratic ideology, the Young Ottoman movement, composed largely of educated bureaucrats and intellectuals, further politicized the civil service. They produced newspapers, pamphlets, and political essays calling for liberal reforms, parliamentary governance, and greater civil liberties. Their rhetoric framed the bureaucracy as a vehicle for enlightenment and national revival, challenging the autocratic traditions of the sultanic regime. Bureaucracy as a political battlefield. By the late 19th century, the Ottoman bureaucracy had become a political battlefield where reformists, conservatives, and palace loyalists vied for influence. Policy debates were fought not only in the divan but also in administrative offices, where the drafting of a decree or the wording of a legal code could have profound political implications. Civil servants now operated with a dual identity, as administrators of the state and as active participants in the empire's political discourse. The risks of political ambition, however, the rise of the bureaucrat politician was fraught with peril. Midhat Pasha's eventual exile and assassination underscored the risks of challenging entrenched power structures. Bureaucrats who ventured too far into political activism often faced backlash from conservative forces within the court and the military. Yet, their influence persisted. The bureaucratic elite had tasted political power, and their legacy would resonate in the empire's final decades. A new model of governance, the evolution of the bureaucrat politician, heralded a shift towards technocratic governance. Expertise, not just loyalty, became a currency of power. While the empire continued to grapple with corruption and inefficiency, its administration increasingly relied on a cadre of officials who combined bureaucratic skill with political acumen. This new model would deeply influence the formation of the modern Turkish Republic, where civil servants and technocrats would play pivotal roles in nation-building. The dawn of the 20th century brought seismic shifts to the Ottoman Empire's political landscape. The long-simmering tensions between reformists and autocrats culminated in the Young Turk Revolution of 1908, restoring the Ottoman constitution and inaugurating the Second Constitutional Era. In this new political order, the empire's bureaucracy faced both unprecedented opportunities and daunting challenges. The Young Turks and the bureaucratic vision, the Committee of Union and Progress, often referred to as the Young Turks, envisioned a modern, centralized state governed by constitutional principles. Their blueprint for reform leaned heavily on the administrative apparatus. For the Young Turks, the bureaucracy was not merely a tool of governance. It was the backbone of national rejuvenation. They sought to transform civil servants into agents of modernization, loyal not to the Sultan but to the constitution and the nation. The civil service under constitutionalism. With the re-establishment of parliament and political parties, the bureaucracy entered a new phase of politicization. Civil servants now operated within a parliamentary framework, where their actions could be questioned, scrutinized, and even overturned by elected representatives. However, far from diminishing their influence, this shift elevated bureaucrats as indispensable mediators between political directives and administrative execution. Ministries became power centers where bureaucrat technocrats crafted policies in line with constitutional ideals. Bureaucratic reforms and centralization. The Young Turk regime embarked on a campaign to further centralize administrative control. Provincial governors were brought under tighter scrutiny, and local councils were restructured to ensure alignment with central government policies. Standardized civil service examinations were introduced to curb nepotism, and a clear hierarchy of merit-based promotions was established. These measures aimed to professionalize the bureaucracy, making it more efficient and less susceptible to local power dynamics. Tensions between parliament and bureaucracy. Yet, the constitutional era was marked by persistent friction between elected parliamentarians and the entrenched bureaucratic elite. Deputies often accused bureaucrats of resisting democratic oversight, clinging to old habits of administrative opacity. Conversely, many civil servants viewed the often inexperienced parliamentarians as meddling amateurs, ill-equipped to grasp the complexities of governance. This tension created a push-pull dynamic where bureaucratic expertise clashed with political populism. The role of bureaucrats in policymaking. Despite parliamentary oversight, the bureaucracy retained substantial influence in shaping policy. Technocrats within the ministries, leveraging their institutional knowledge, often guided legislative drafting, ensuring laws were administratively feasible. Key figures like Talat Pasha, who rose from a telegraph clerk to become Minister of Interior and eventually Grand Vizier, exemplified the fusion of bureaucratic skill with political leadership. Bureaucracy and national identity. The constitutional era also saw the bureaucracy take an active role in nation building. Policies aimed at forging a cohesive Ottoman identity placed bureaucrats at the forefront of educational reforms, population censuses, and infrastructure projects. Civil servants were dispatched to remote provinces to implement Turkification policies, modernize schools, and standardize administrative procedures. Through these efforts, the bureaucracy became an instrument of social engineering, bureaucratic challenges amidst political turmoil. However, the promise of constitutional governance was soon tested by political instability, military defeats, and external pressures. The Balkan Wars and World War I strained the empire's administrative capacity to its limits. Bureaucrats faced the daunting task of managing refugee crises, coordinating war logistics, and maintaining public order amidst widespread chaos. In many instances, civil servants became de facto governors of collapsing regions, holding the administrative fabric together as the empire crumbled around them. The limits of constitutional bureaucracy. While the Second Constitutional Era expanded the bureaucracy's role in governance, it also exposed the limitations of a system grappling with internal divisions and external threats. The bureaucratic reforms, though ambitious, were unevenly implemented, often outpaced by the empire's rapid decline. Yet, the experience of operating within a constitutional framework left an indelible mark on the Ottoman civil service. It cultivated a generation of bureaucrats who believed in governance based on law, meritocracy, and public accountability. Legacy and continuity. As the Ottoman Empire edged towards dissolution, the bureaucratic institutions and practices honed during the constitutional era laid the groundwork for future governance models. Many of the administrators who served during this period would later transition into roles within the nascent Turkish Republic, carrying with them the lessons and aspirations of constitutional bureaucracy. When the Ottoman Empire entered World War I in 1914, its bureaucracy faced a crisis unlike any before. The machinery of governance, already strained by years of political turmoil and territorial losses, was now tasked with managing a total war. Bureaucrats found themselves at the front lines of administrative survival, grappling with challenges that would either redefine or break the empire's civil service. Mobilizing an empire through paperwork. The first and most immediate task for the Ottoman bureaucracy was mobilization. Draft orders, supply requisitions, and logistical directives flooded government offices. The empire's sprawling network of civil servants became a wartime command structure, coordinating troop movements, conscription drives, and resource allocations. Yet the bureaucracy was woefully unprepared for the scale of the task. Many provinces lacked the infrastructure to support efficient communication, and corruption at local levels undermined the effectiveness of centralized orders. Refugee crises and humanitarian breakdown. The Balkan Wars had already set off waves of refugee movements, but World War I escalated the crisis to catastrophic levels. Entire populations were displaced as front lines shifted and ethnic cleansing campaigns intensified. Civil servants were tasked with managing refugee camps, distributing aid, and maintaining civil order amidst chaos. However, limited resources, bureaucratic inertia, and competing military demands overwhelmed administrative capacities. In many cases, local bureaucrats improvised solutions, relying on personal networks and ad hoc arrangements to prevent total societal collapse. The Armenian genocide and bureaucratic complicity. One of the darkest chapters of the war was the systematic deportation and mass murder of Armenians, orchestrated under the guise of wartime security measures. The Ottoman bureaucracy played a pivotal role in implementing these policies. Officials in the Ministry of Interior drafted deportation orders, provincial governors organized the logistics, and local civil servants facilitated the forced march. While some bureaucrats resisted or attempted to subvert these orders, the majority complied, entangling the administrative apparatus in acts of atrocity. This period marked a profound moral crisis within the Ottoman bureaucracy, as the machinery designed for governance was repurposed for genocide. Wartime economy and bureaucratic overreach managing the wartime economy became another monumental task. The state imposed price controls, requisitioned supplies, and attempted to regulate trade. Bureaucrats were dispatched to enforce these measures, often clashing with merchants and local power brokers. However, rampant corruption, black markets, and administrative inefficiency hampered these efforts. Attempts to centralize economic control frequently resulted in bureaucratic overreach, exacerbating shortages and fueling public resentment, communication breakdown, and administrative isolation. The war severely disrupted lines of communication. Telegraph lines were often cut, and the flow of information between the capital and the provinces became erratic. Isolated from Istanbul, many provincial administrations were forced to operate autonomously, making critical decisions without guidance. This decentralization, born of necessity, further fragmented the empire's already weakened administrative cohesion. Bureaucrats as de facto governors in many regions, particularly those far from the front lines, bureaucrats assumed de facto governance roles. With military commanders preoccupied and political leadership faltering, civil servants became the primary authority figures. These bureaucrats juggled an impossible array of duties, managing food distribution, maintaining public order, overseeing refugee relief, and navigating the shifting allegiances of local notables. Internal surveillance and censorship. As paranoia about internal dissent grew, the Ottoman state expanded its surveillance apparatus. Bureaucrats were enlisted to monitor public sentiment, report seditious activities, and enforce censorship regulations. The war thus transformed the bureaucracy into an instrument of internal control, tasked not only with administration but also with policing loyalty to the state. The human cost of administrative collapse. By 1918, the Ottoman bureaucracy was a shell of its former self. Years of war, corruption, and overextension had hollowed out its effectiveness. Civil servants worked in understaffed offices, salaries went unpaid, and morale plummeted. For the ordinary citizens, the breakdown of administrative services meant chaos. Essential functions like tax collection, legal adjudication, and public health collapsed, leaving many regions in a state of lawlessness. Seeds of a post-war bureaucracy. Yet, amidst the collapse, seeds of a future bureaucracy were sown. The crisis compelled a new generation of civil servants to develop resilience, adaptability, and a pragmatic approach to governance. These experiences would later influence the administrative ethos of the Republic of Turkey. World War I had pushed the Ottoman bureaucracy to its breaking point, but in doing so, it also forged a cadre of bureaucrats who would carry forward the lessons of survival into a new political order. As World War I ended in disaster for the Ottoman Empire, the once mighty bureaucracy found itself in an existential crisis. The empire was crumbling, its territories carved up by victorious powers, and its administrative system stretched to the breaking point. The twilight years of Ottoman rule were marked by desperation, disintegration, and attempts to salvage governance amid collapse. Administrative disintegration and territorial loss. The post-war treaties, most notably the Treaty of Sevres, dismembered the Ottoman lands, stripping away vast regions. Provincial administrations lost authority as new occupying forces and nationalist movements asserted control. Bureaucrats found themselves caught between orders from Istanbul and the realities on the ground. In some areas, local officials collaborated with occupying powers. In others, they resisted or fled. The administrative fabric of the empire frayed as communication lines were severed and the central government's influence waned. Collapse of institutional authority. The imperial bureaucracy, once the embodiment of centralized power, rapidly lost its coherence. Ministries ceased functioning effectively as officials deserted their posts or faced shortages of resources and personnel. Record-keeping, tax collection, and judicial processes all deteriorated. The bureaucrats who remained faced the impossible task of maintaining order in a disintegrating state, often relying on personal networks and improvisation to keep services afloat. The rise of nationalist administration amidst the empire's collapse. Emerging nationalist movements, most notably Mustafa Kemal's Turkish national movement, began constructing their own administrative structures. These nascent bureaucracies drew heavily from Ottoman experience but were fundamentally different in ideology and objectives. Many Ottoman civil servants defected to the nationalist cause, bringing with them expertise and institutional knowledge that would shape the foundation of the new Turkish Republic. Bureaucratic responses to crisis. The bureaucracy's response to the empire's collapse was uneven. While some officials remained loyal to the Sultan's government in Istanbul, others aligned with nationalist or regional interests. Corruption and factionalism worsened as loyalty became fragmented. In certain provinces, local bureaucrats seized power, acting as warlords or autonomous rulers, further undermining imperial authority. The moral and practical decline. The final years of Ottoman bureaucracy were marred by moral decay and administrative dysfunction. Bribery, nepotism, and inefficiency became rampant as the system struggled to survive. Essential services collapsed, fueling public despair and chaos. Despite these failures, the bureaucracy's decades-long legacy provided a structural template for governance that would survive beyond the empire. Fall, legacy and transition. Though the Ottoman bureaucracy faltered in the empire's final years, its institutional memory, practices, and personnel laid the groundwork for modern Turkish administration. The transition from empire to republic was, in many ways, a bureaucratic evolution, carrying forward elements of continuity amid radical political change. The story of the Ottoman bureaucracy in its twilight is one of both collapse and rebirth, where the old world structures gave way to new foundations. When the dust of the Ottoman Empire's fall settled, and the new Turkish Republic was declared in 1923, it was not just a change of rulers or borders, it was a monumental shift in the very way a vast and complex society was governed. Yet beneath the revolutionary slogans and sweeping reforms lay a critical truth. The newborn republic inherited a sprawling, centuries-old Ottoman bureaucracy. This bureaucracy was both a treasure trove of institutional memory and a challenge demanding radical reform. The Ottoman Empire had governed over a mosaic of peoples, languages, and traditions through an intricate administrative system. The empire's collapse threatened to unleash chaos across Anatolia and beyond. However, the new Turkish state needed order, stability, and governance. This impossible task required drawing heavily on the legacy of the Ottoman civil service, even as the Republic sought to transform its identity. Institutional continuity amid political upheaval. The Ottoman bureaucracy was not a monolithic relic frozen in time. It was a living, breathing institution. Many Ottoman civil servants, trained in decades of imperial governance, found themselves at the crossroads of history. Some remained loyal to the empire until the end, but a significant number transitioned to serve the new Republican government. These officials brought with them essential skills, expertise in tax collection, land registration, law enforcement, and administrative procedures. Their knowledge kept the machinery of government turning, ensuring that the Republic did not have to build its civil service from scratch. The Republic, therefore, was not starting with a blank slate. It was inheriting a vast administrative network, replete with archives, bureaucratic customs, and, crucially, experienced personnel. This legacy was both a lifeline and a complex burden, as many Ottoman-era practices were steeped in traditions incompatible with Republican ideals. Reforms. Towards a modern, secular bureaucracy, the Republican leadership, under Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, understood that modernization of the bureaucracy was essential to building a new nation-state. The Ottoman civil service was often criticized for nepotism, religious favoritism, and inefficiency. Reforming these issues became a priority. In 1926, the law on civil servants was enacted. This law aimed to professionalize the bureaucracy by establishing merit-based recruitment and promotion. Positions were no longer to be handed out as political favors or family legacies. Instead, they required qualifications, examinations, and clear performance standards. This law also secularized the civil service, removing the religious underpinnings that had often influenced Ottoman administration. The aim was a neutral, loyal cadre of civil servants who served the Republic as secular laws and policies rather than religious courts or imperial decrees. Education and training. Creating a new bureaucratic elite to ensure the success of this reform, the Republic revamped its educational institutions. The famous Ottoman-era Mektab-i which had trained generations of bureaucrats, was transformed into the Academy of Political Sciences. Here, students were trained not only in traditional administration but also in modern political science, economics, law, and foreign languages. The curriculum emphasized Republican values, nationalism, secularism, and progress. This new generation of bureaucrats was expected to be loyal to the Republic's ideals and capable of implementing its ambitious reform programs, from land redistribution to education and infrastructure development. Centralization and tightened control. One of the Republic's most significant bureaucratic shifts was centralization. The Ottoman Empire, despite its strong central government, had tolerated varying degrees of local autonomy across its vast territories. In contrast, the Turkish Republic sought to impose tight central control. Provincial governors were appointed directly by Ankara, with little room for local deviation. This centralization was designed to unify the country under one national policy, minimizing ethnic and regional differences that had previously complicated governance. Civil servants were tasked with enforcing this unity, overseeing language reforms that replaced Ottoman Turkish with a purified Turkish language, implementing population registration to track citizens, and driving policies of Turkification that sought to create a cohesive national identity. Bureaucracy as an agent of nation building. The Republican bureaucracy was not just a tool for administration, it was an active agent of nation building. Through the civil service, the state disseminated its ideology and policies to every corner of the country. Civil servants opened new schools to replace traditional religious institutions, supervised the introduction of Latin script in place of Arabic script, and managed large-scale infrastructure projects like roads, railways, and factories. They were also responsible for enforcing secularism, ensuring the separation of religion from governance, a dramatic break from the Ottoman past where Islamic law had a central place in administration. This transformation required not only paperwork but also cultural change. Bureaucrats became educators, mediators, and sometimes enforcers of the Republic's vision of modernity. Challenges and resistance. However, reforming the Ottoman bureaucracy was no easy feat. Deep-rooted habits, patronage networks, and local resistance persisted. Corruption, inefficiency, and nepotism remained problems, particularly in rural areas where old power structures held sway. Some Ottoman-era officials who resisted change were replaced, but many adapted to the new system. Additionally, the aggressive centralization and Turkification policies sparked tensions with ethnic and religious minorities who viewed the new bureaucracy as an instrument of cultural assimilation and control. Legacy and influence on modern Turkey. Despite these challenges, the Republican bureaucracy proved remarkably durable. It provided the institutional backbone necessary for Turkey's rapid modernization throughout the 20th century. Many administrative practices and organizational structures from the Ottoman period were retained, albeit under a new ideological framework. The Republic demonstrated how an empire's bureaucratic heritage could be both a foundation for a modern state and a source of continuity amid radical change. The Ottoman bureaucratic legacy also influenced the civil service culture, emphasizing order, hierarchy, and loyalty to the state, traits that remain evident in Turkey's governance today. In the quiet ink and paper of Ottoman archives, the new republic found its future. The empire had fallen, but its bureaucracy lived on, transformed, secularized, and nationalized, carrying the weight of history into the dawn of a new nation. The Ottoman Empire was vast and diverse, a sprawling mosaic of peoples, religions, and languages stretching across 3 continents. Yet, at its heart lay a bureaucracy that did more than administer laws and collect taxes. It shaped the empire's very identity through language, art, and culture. This part of the empire's legacy is often overlooked, but it reveals how the pen was as mighty as the sword, forging a unique cultural imprint that lasted centuries. Ottoman Turkish. The language of power and bureaucracy, the language used by the Ottoman bureaucracy, was not the everyday Turkish spoken in the streets. Instead, it was Ottoman Turkish, a sophisticated, hybrid language blending Turkish grammar with a vast vocabulary drawn from Arabic and Persian. This linguistic concoction was deliberately cultivated over centuries to serve the needs of administration, law, and high culture. Ottoman Turkish was the language of the elite, written in the elegant Arabic script. It was learned through rigorous education in schools attached to the palace and religious institutions. To be part of the bureaucracy meant mastering this complex tongue, filled with poetic flourishes and legal jargon. This language became a symbol of power and exclusivity. Ordinary people found it nearly impossible to understand official documents or imperial edicts. This linguistic barrier was a gatekeeper, preserving the bureaucracy as a specialized elite class within the empire. Calligraphy, the art that defined bureaucratic authority beyond language. The Ottoman bureaucracy was renowned for its mastery of calligraphy. Far from being mere scribes, Ottoman bureaucrats were trained artists who turned the written word into visual masterpieces. Calligraphy was considered the highest form of Islamic art, embodying both aesthetic beauty and spiritual reverence. Every official document, from tax records and property deeds to imperial decrees called firmans, was adorned with meticulous calligraphic script. At the pinnacle was the Sultan's tukra, the imperial signature and seal, a swirling, intricate emblem designed by master calligraphers. The tukra was more than a signature. It was a visual representation of the Sultan's authority, grace, and power. Scribes trained in palace schools learned various calligraphic styles, each with its own rules and purposes. Some scripts were used for formal decrees, others for poetry or personal correspondence. This art transformed bureaucracy from a mechanical process into a cultural performance, infusing administration with symbolism and grandeur. The bureaucratic identity, guardians of imperial memory and culture. For Ottoman bureaucrats, their work was not merely clerical, it was a mission to uphold the empire's memory and identity. They were custodians of vast archives filled with legal codes, land registers, tax documents, and diplomatic correspondence. Each page recorded the empire's sprawling reach and diverse populations. This archival culture fostered a bureaucratic identity distinct from other social classes. The bureaucracy was a closed world with its own hierarchies, rituals, and privileges. Learning to read, write, and navigate the intricate administrative language was a rite of passage, marking entrance into a privileged elite. Their offices, adorned with ornate calligraphic scrolls and maps, were temples of imperial knowledge. The bureaucracy was the empire's memory bank, preserving its history and ensuring continuity across generations and borders. Language, identity, and power, the double-edged sword. While Ottoman Turkish and calligraphy united the empire's elites, they also created divides. The language barrier separated the rulers from the ruled, sometimes deepening social and ethnic divides within the diverse empire. This cultural divide was especially significant in the 19th and early 20th centuries as nationalist movements grew among Arabs, Armenians, Greeks, and others. These groups increasingly sought to assert their own languages and identities against the centralized Ottoman bureaucracy's linguistic monopoly. The bureaucratic language became a symbol of imperial dominance, a reminder of the sultanic authority that controlled local affairs through paperwork, courts, and tax registers. Cultural legacy, from empire to republic and beyond. The fall of the Ottoman Empire did not erase this cultural imprint. The Turkish Republic replaced Ottoman Turkish with a purified Turkish language written in Latin script as part of sweeping modernization reforms. Yet the bureaucratic ethos of order, discipline, and reverence for paperwork remained. Calligraphy survived as a respected art form, appreciated for its historical and aesthetic value rather than its administrative function. Today, Ottoman calligraphy is celebrated in museums and galleries worldwide, a testament to the empire's unique cultural synthesis. The bureaucratic culture, the language, the scripts, the archival traditions has influenced modern Turkish administration and broader Middle Eastern governance, reminding us that empire building was as much about culture and identity as it was about conquest and control. The Ottoman Empire may have dissolved, but its bureaucratic legacy continues to echo through the corridors of Middle Eastern governance to this day. Across former Ottoman territories, from the Balkans to the Levant, administrative structures, legal systems, and even bureaucratic mindsets bear the unmistakable imprint of centuries of Ottoman rule. In this part, we explore how the Ottoman bureaucratic model influenced the modern states that rose from its ashes. Bureaucracy as a state-building template. When the Ottoman Empire's territories were partitioned after World War I, new nation-states like Iraq, Syria, Jordan, and Lebanon emerged, often under British or French mandates. Despite the colonial influence, these new governments leaned heavily on the existing Ottoman administrative frameworks. The provincial divisions, tax systems, and legal codes established by the Ottomans provided a ready-made template for governance. Former Ottoman officials and scribes found employment in the new administrations, bringing with them decades of bureaucratic experience. In many ways, these successor states inherited not just land but a bureaucratic culture of record-keeping, centralized authority, and a legalistic approach to governance. The Arab states, inheriting Ottoman administrative DNA. In Syria and Iraq, much of the Ottoman provincial infrastructure remained intact well into the mid-20th century. Cities like Aleppo, Damascus, and Baghdad continued to function as administrative hubs, using land registries, tax rolls, and court systems that had been formalized during Ottoman rule. Even the title of mutasarrif persisted in administrative usage for years after the empire's fall. Ottoman-trained judges and bureaucrats staffed the new ministries, ensuring continuity even as nationalist movements sought to redefine state identities. Egypt and the semi-Ottoman legacy. Egypt's case was unique. While technically an Ottoman province, Egypt had operated with substantial autonomy under the Muhammad Ali dynasty. Nevertheless, its bureaucratic culture was influenced by Ottoman administrative practices. Legal codes, particularly in the domains of property and family law, bore Ottoman hallmarks. The influence extended to administrative titles, ceremonial court protocols, and a bureaucratic emphasis on hierarchy and formal documentation. The Balkans, bureaucracy amidst fragmentation. In the Balkans, newly independent states like Serbia, Bulgaria, and Greece initially adopted Ottoman administrative practices before gradually replacing them with their national systems. Yet the legacy of cadastral surveys, land registries, and legal documentation endured. Ottoman bureaucratic methods had introduced these states to the concept of state-managed property rights and formal legal adjudication, practices that form the backbone of their emerging governance structures. The Ottoman legal legacy. One of the most enduring Ottoman bureaucratic exports was the Mesel, the empire's civil code based on Islamic jurisprudence but organized in a systematic, codified manner. The Mesel remained in force in many former Ottoman territories well into the 20th century. In Palestine, Jordan, Syria, and Iraq, the Mesel influenced family law, contract law, and property disputes, forming a legal bedrock even as modern nation-states sought to develop their own codes. Centralization versus local autonomy, a central theme of Ottoman administration, was the balancing act between centralized control from Istanbul and practical autonomy for provincial elites. This tension was inherited by successor states, many of which struggled with managing diverse ethnic, religious, and tribal groups within centralized governance frameworks. For example, Iraq's early governments mirrored Ottoman strategies by co-opting tribal leaders into formal governance roles, a practice that persists in various forms to this day. Bureaucratic culture, hierarchy, formalism, and patronage beyond structures and laws. The Ottoman bureaucracy left a cultural imprint on how governance was perceived. The formality of court procedures, the elaborate rituals of official correspondence, and the patronage networks that greased bureaucratic wheels found echoes in many modern Middle Eastern administrations. This bureaucratic ethos, emphasizing hierarchy and the sanctity of officialdom, often clashed with Western models of streamlined governance, yet remained deeply ingrained in the political culture of successor states. Challenges of reform, the Ottoman legacy's double-edged sword, while the Ottoman bureaucratic heritage provided a vital administrative foundation, it also presented challenges. The emphasis on centralized control sometimes stifled local governance initiatives. Patronage networks, while providing social cohesion, often bred corruption and inefficiency. Reform movements throughout the 20th century, from Arab nationalist regimes to Western-influenced modernization drives, grappled with dismantling or reforming these inherited bureaucratic traditions. Yet the ghost of Ottoman governance proved remarkably resilient. The modern Middle Eastern bureaucrat, a descendant of Ottoman scribes today, many bureaucratic practices across the Middle East still carry Ottoman DNA. From the structure of ministries to the procedures of land registration offices, the empire's legacy lingers. Even the ceremonial language of officialdom, with its emphasis on titles, formal petitions, and deference to hierarchy, can trace its roots to Ottoman court protocols. In Turkey itself, the transformation from empire to republic did not erase this bureaucratic heritage. It merely reshaped it under a new national ideology. Similarly, in Arab states, Ottoman administrative structures became the scaffolding upon which modern state institutions were built. A legacy beyond borders. The Ottoman bureaucracy's influence transcends national borders. It established a regional administrative culture that, despite the rise and fall of states, continues to shape governance norms across the Middle East and the Balkans. This legacy is a testament to the enduring power of bureaucratic systems. Empires may fall, but their paper trails, their administrative habits, and their governance philosophies often outlive their political boundaries. Empires are often remembered for their armies, conquests, and monumental architecture. But the Ottoman Empire, lasting over 6 centuries, was held together by something far less visible, yet infinitely more powerful: bureaucracy. Long after the swords were sheathed and the wars subsided, it was the empire's civil servants, scribes, and clerks who quietly ensured that an incredibly diverse and sprawling territory remained connected. This was the invisible empire, an empire of paper, ink, and protocol. The empire's silent engine while sultans reigned and viziers plotted. It was the bureaucracy that kept the empire functioning day to day. Taxes were collected, disputes were adjudicated, trade was regulated, and imperial orders were disseminated through a vast network of officials operating behind the scenes. From the bustling divans of Istanbul to remote village courts, bureaucrats were the empire's lifeblood. They spoke multiple languages, navigated local customs, and interpreted imperial edicts to suit the needs of far-flung provinces. Standardization across diversity, the Ottoman Empire ruled over an extraordinary diversity of peoples: Turks, Arabs, Greeks, Armenians, Kurds, Jews, and countless others. Each group had its own language, religion, and legal traditions. The challenge was governing this mosaic without constant revolt. Bureaucracy offered a solution. Through standardized records, codified laws, and meticulous tax registers like the Tahrir Defters, the Ottomans created a uniform administrative framework that transcended ethnic and religious divides. Yet this standardization was flexible. The Ottomans allowed various communities a degree of autonomy, permitting them to govern internal affairs as long as they adhered to the empire's broader administrative expectations. Communication, the arteries of empire. One of the greatest challenges was ensuring that orders from Istanbul reached the empire's most distant corners. This required a robust communication network of couriers, relay stations, and official scribes. Official documents were copied in triplicate, sealed with the Sultan's tukra, and dispatched with a precision that modern postal systems would admire. A firman issued in Istanbul could, within weeks, dictate policy in Cairo, Baghdad, or Sarajevo. This bureaucratic web ensured that the empire could react to crises, enforce laws, and maintain a semblance of unity across its vast expanse. The role of archives. The empire's memory, every decision, transaction, and dispute was meticulously recorded and archived. The imperial archives of Istanbul became a labyrinthine repository of the empire's institutional memory. These archives were not passive storage spaces, but active tools of governance. When land disputes arose or questions of inheritance were contested, scribes would retrieve records from decades prior to validate claims. The archival system allowed the empire to govern through precedent and documentation, ensuring consistency and authority across generations. Bureaucracy as a mediator of power. The Ottoman bureaucracy served as a buffer between the Sultan's authority and local power brokers. While the empire officially endorsed centralized rule, in practice, the bureaucracy negotiated with provincial elites, balancing imperial directives with local realities. Governors, tax farmers, and religious leaders often operated with considerable autonomy, but their actions were legitimized through bureaucratic documentation. A land grant, for instance, was meaningless without the official seal from the imperial chancery. This system allowed the empire to maintain control without resorting to constant military intervention, making bureaucracy a more cost-effective means of governance. Crisis management. Bureaucracy in action during periods of crisis, whether rebellions, famines, or plagues. The bureaucracy's ability to coordinate responses was pivotal. Provincial reports would flood Istanbul, prompting dispatches of relief orders, tax exemptions, or military reinforcements. While the system was not infallible and often plagued by corruption, its capacity to respond to emergencies was remarkable for its time. The human face of bureaucracy behind. The walls of administrative buildings were thousands of individuals whose careers spanned decades. Scribes, translators, tax collectors, and judges formed an elite class of state functionaries. Their identities were shaped not by ethnic lineage, but by their role within the imperial machinery. This meritocratic aspect of the bureaucracy allowed individuals of diverse backgrounds to ascend the administrative hierarchy, provided they mastered the requisite skills and languages. Bureaucratic rituals and ceremonies, even the rituals of bureaucracy, reinforced imperial authority. The presentation of petitions, the formal reading of decrees, and the elaborate protocols of court proceedings were all performances designed to project order and legitimacy. These ceremonies turned administration into a spectacle, reinforcing the Sultan's presence in the lives of his subjects, even in his physical absence. The invisible empire's legacy, though less visible than military conquests or architectural wonders, the Ottoman bureaucracy's impact was perhaps its most enduring legacy. It allowed an empire of remarkable diversity to function as a coherent political entity for over 6 centuries. Today, the bureaucratic principles established by the Ottomans continue to influence governance structures across former territories. The emphasis on meticulous record-keeping, centralized yet flexible administration, and the use of bureaucracy as a mediator of power remains, deeply embedded in the political cultures of Turkey and the broader Middle East. Empires fall, but their bureaucracies linger, often mutating and adapting to the technological frontiers of new eras. In the digital age, the bureaucratic systems once pioneered by the Ottoman Empire have found themselves reborn, not in dusty ledgers and ink-stained archives, but in databases, online portals, and digital governance frameworks. The paper empire has gone digital, from scrolls to servers, archival continuity. The Ottoman Empire was obsessed with documentation. Its officials meticulously recorded every land deed, tax assessment, and legal proceeding. These records, housed in the imperial archives of Istanbul, formed the backbone of governance for centuries. Today, the digitization of these archives represents more than a technological update. It is a continuation of the empire's bureaucratic culture. Vast efforts have been undertaken to scan, index, and make these historical documents accessible through digital platforms. What once required a pilgrimage to the Topkapi Palace or the Ottoman Archives building can now be accessed through a few keystrokes. This transition preserves the bureaucratic principle of centralized knowledge control, ensuring that history remains an active instrument of governance, scholarship, and public record. E-government. The new Ottoman administrative spirit. Turkey's ambitious e-government initiatives, such as the E-Devlet Kapask, can be seen as a digital manifestation of Ottoman administrative ethos. These platforms consolidate citizen services from property records and legal documents to healthcare and taxation into a unified digital interface. This drive towards centralized bureaucratic efficiency mirrors the empire's historic obsession with order, standardization, and oversight. The difference lies in the medium. Where once armies of scribes would labor over parchment, today databases and algorithms ensure administrative cohesion. Digital millets, autonomy in the virtual realm. The Ottoman millet system allowed religious and ethnic communities a degree of self-governance under the umbrella of imperial oversight. Interestingly, the digital age has recreated similar structures within governance platforms. Community-specific portals, cultural heritage databases, and localized administrative platforms allow modern states to provide tailored services to distinct population groups, echoing the Ottoman balance between central authority and localized autonomy. While the context has evolved, the underlying principle remains leveraging bureaucracy to manage diversity through flexible yet standardized systems. Bureaucratic transparency versus digital red tape. One of the promises of digitization is transparency. Digital platforms have the potential to reduce corruption, streamline procedures, and make governance more accessible. However, they also risk replicating and even amplifying traditional bureaucratic challenges. In many former Ottoman territories, citizens still navigate labyrinthine online procedures reminiscent of the empire's notorious red tape. Forms, approvals, and certifications now exist in virtual formats, but the cultural legacy of procedural complexity persists. Yet this continuity is not entirely detrimental. The meticulousness ingrained in Ottoman bureaucratic practices ensures that digital systems are thorough, precise, and legally robust, providing a stable framework for governance in an era of rapid technological change. Digital archives as political instruments. The digitization of Ottoman records has not only academic but also political implications. Historical land deeds, court records, and imperial decrees are frequently referenced in modern territorial disputes, property claims, and heritage debates. States and communities leverage these digital archives to assert historical rights, challenging contemporary narratives with meticulously preserved bureaucratic documentation. The empire's paper trail, once a tool of administration, has become a weapon in diplomatic and legal arenas. Bureaucratic culture in the age of social media. While technology has transformed the tools of governance, cultural attitudes towards bureaucracy remain deeply rooted. Formal language, ceremonial communication, and hierarchical protocols persist in official correspondence, even in emails and online forms. Social media, however, introduces a disruptive element. Citizens now have platforms to publicly challenge bureaucratic inefficiencies, demand accountability, and mobilize collective action. This tension between a traditionally hierarchical bureaucratic culture and the democratizing forces of digital communication is a defining feature of governance in the digital age. Training digital bureaucrats. The new scribal schools, just as the Ottoman Empire established scribal schools to train its bureaucrats in calligraphy, law, and administration. Modern institutions now train digital administrators. Courses in e-governance, data management, and digital policy echo the rigorous training once imparted to Ottoman scribes. These digital bureaucrats are the new custodians of state information, responsible for maintaining the integrity of digital archives, managing citizen data, and ensuring that governance remains coherent in an increasingly complex digital landscape. The globalization of Ottoman bureaucratic principles. Interestingly, many of the bureaucratic practices refined by the Ottomans, such as meticulous record-keeping, standardized administrative divisions, and flexible yet centralized governance models, have found global resonance. International organizations, multinational corporations, and modern nation-states adopt similar bureaucratic strategies, albeit through advanced technological infrastructures. The principles remain the same. Only the scale and tools have evolved. Bureaucracy beyond borders. The digital age has dissolved physical boundaries, creating virtual bureaucracies that operate across nations. Cloud-based data systems, international legal databases, and cross-border administrative collaborations are the new frontiers of governance. In this sense, the Ottoman bureaucratic legacy has transcended its geographic origins. influencing global governance structures in subtle yet profound ways. The paper empire reimagined the Ottoman Empire's bureaucracy was a marvel of its time, managing a vast and diverse realm through the disciplined application of record-keeping, standardization, and hierarchical administration. Today, that invisible empire lives on in servers, algorithms, and digital platforms. The tools have changed, but the bureaucratic mindset, the belief in order through documentation, governance through procedure, and power through information remains as potent as ever. The story of the Ottoman bureaucracy is not merely a tale of dusty archives, elaborate decrees, and endless paperwork. It is a testament to how an administrative system can shape the destiny of an empire and influence governance models long after its fall. In this concluding part, we explore the timeless lessons that the Ottoman bureaucracy offers to modern states and organizations navigating the complexities of governance. Lesson 1. Flexibility within centralization. One of the Ottoman bureaucracy's greatest strengths was its ability to balance centralized control with local autonomy. The empire managed a vast and diverse population by creating standardized administrative frameworks while allowing local communities, such as the millets, to govern their internal affairs. Modern states grappling with multicultural populations and regional differences can draw from this lesson. Centralized authority need not come at the expense of local identity. Rather, flexible governance structures that respect local customs can enhance stability and cohesion. Lesson 2. The power of documentation. The Ottoman obsession with record-keeping was not bureaucratic vanity. It was a strategic tool of governance. Every land deed, tax assessment, and legal ruling was meticulously documented, creating a robust archival system that ensured continuity and accountability. In an era of misinformation and administrative opacity, the principle of thorough documentation remains vital. Transparent, accessible records build trust between citizens and the state, while detailed archives preserve institutional memory across generations. Lesson 3. Bureaucracy as a mediator of power. The Ottoman bureaucracy acted as an intermediary between the Sultan's central authority and local power brokers. By legitimizing provincial power through official documentation and protocols, the empire maintained order without constant military intervention. Modern governments and organizations can learn from this mediation strategy. Effective bureaucracies serve as neutral arbiters, balancing the interests of central leadership with those of regional or departmental actors, thus preventing power struggles from escalating into conflicts. Lesson 4. The role of ritual and ceremony. Ottoman bureaucratic rituals, be it the formal reading of a firman or the presentation of petitions, reinforced the authority of the state and instilled a sense of order and legitimacy. While modern governance favors efficiency over pomp, the symbolic value of certain bureaucratic rituals should not be underestimated. Ceremonies that acknowledge citizen engagement, public service awards, and formal protocols can enhance institutional prestige and foster civic pride. Lesson 5. Investing in administrative talent. The empire's scribal schools were more than training centers. They were institutions that cultivated a class of highly skilled administrators. Mastery of languages, legal codes, and calligraphy ensured that bureaucrats were both competent and culturally attuned. Today, as digital governance evolves, the importance of investing in administrative education is paramount. Training programs that emphasize not just technical skills but also ethics, communication, and cultural sensitivity are essential for building effective and responsive bureaucracies. Lesson 6. The long-term vision of governance. The Ottoman bureaucracy operated with a long-term perspective. Decisions were recorded with the understanding that they would have implications decades, even centuries, into the future. This foresight allowed the empire to maintain coherence over vast territories for over 6 centuries. In a world often dominated by short-term political gains, the Ottoman example underscores the value of long-term strategic planning and governance. Policies rooted in sustainable practices and institutional continuity can weather political changes and societal upheavals. Lesson 7. Information as power. The centralization of knowledge in imperial archives granted the Ottoman bureaucracy immense power. Information was not merely stored, it was actively used to resolve disputes, legitimize authority, and shape policy. In the digital age, data governance has become a critical pillar of statcraft, ensuring data integrity, securing citizen information, and utilizing data-driven insights for policymaking are contemporary extensions of this automated